Hello, everyone, and welcome to live coverage of the Vintage main event from the Eternal Weekend in Prague. We have a little under 128 players, which means that we're running 7 rounds. And the top 8 today, since we had to cover the top 8 of the Legacy Championship earlier, we're going to be starting with, I believe, round number 3. And I'm here sitting with Andreas Petersen, the current Vintage Super League champion, who is going to sub in for Skura for this round and give us some interesting insights on a deck that he plays a lot. Andreas, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. So the next best thing after doing well in the tournament is getting invited to cover my favorite format. And as you allude to, yeah, we have something nice coming up here that I might know a thing or two about.
So you play a lot of Vintage, right? Do you play mainly on Magic Online?
Yeah, so I play a lot of old formats on Magic Online, and Vintage is definitely my favorite. I try and play it each weekend, and but now it was time to get the old cards, some fresh air, and play in person, the beautiful city of Prague.
Right. Do you stream? Do you make any kind of content? Like when can the people
Not
where can the people
not
find
yet.
you?
Not yet, but I actually have something in the pipeline. So stay
Okay.
tuned for that for sure.
So something is in the works. All right. We have an interesting match here for you in the first round we're covering, and that is the Oath of Druids deck playing against the Doomsday combo, something you are very familiar with. We have Justin Gennari against David Martin. I'm being told both of these players are content creators, so you can find them often streaming on Twitch. And yeah, Vintage is a very special format. It is not as widely played or widely rather played as something like Standard or
Yeah.
Modern. But it's a very popular format on Magic Online, where the cards are a lot more accessible.
Yeah, that's
than in
like the
real life.
elephant in the room. The prices of the cards. That's nothing to sneeze at. But yeah, I really enjoyed this matchup. So Oath of Druids is a very old deck. Kai Budde used to oath up like terrible creatures back in the day, like Morphling and stuff like that, and extended. But that card is still good to this day. It turns out when you print more and more powerful creatures, that card just keeps staying relevant.
All right, so both of these decks are pretty much combo decks, right? Oath of Druid might be more of a fair-ish combo deck. The Doomsday combo is
Yeah.
typically going to be trying to win in one turn, or what's the dynamic of the matchup? What is the end game of both of these decks?
Yeah, so funnily enough, most like successful vintage decks are able to play the, let's say, I wouldn't call it control route, but like the more passive route, as well as being a fast combo. So that's part of the difficulty when you're playing. You never know if your opponent has a handful of counter magic, or if your opponent has like a lightning fast hand that will beat you in a few turns. So I think this matchup is very, let's say, draw dependent, because both decks play like fast combos, but both decks also play like good control tools like Flusterstorm and Force of Will. So I'm very excited to see these guys opening hand, because that will dictate a lot.
Yeah, Vintage is a format where a lot of stuff happens on the first turn. It's one of the formats where, we keep saying that Standard is a play first format. If you win the IRL, you have such a big advantage. In Vintage, this is even more of a thing, because this is a format where there's a lot of fast mana.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's very fair to say, like in general. So sometimes you have your super fast games. You play a very strong threat turn one, backed up by a Force of Will, and the game is kind of short. Sometimes you have these very, very long games where it comes down to like good timing on your spells, playing around Flusterstorm and stuff like that. So I would say, yeah, probably on average, it's shorter than all other formats, but Vintage can also show a grind game or two for sure.
Yeah, in formats like Legacy, you typically need a good reason to run cards like Mox Diamond, or play the lands like Ancient Tomb, or perhaps you're trying to sort of cheat on mana with other cards, like the pitch cards, or either Vile, cards like that. In Vintage, pretty much every deck gets to run, Black Lotus, all these Moxes, because there is very little reason not to. Looks like the players are ready.
Oh yeah, we see that. I saw a mulligan from Martin, but Justin liked
Yeah, looks like the players are ready for the game, with the mulligans being resolved. Justin starting with a turn one Demonic Tutor. What are the cards that are typically players looking for early in the game? Is Justin interested in finding the Oath? Are there mostly going to be some battles over cards like Ancestral Recall, what's typically the first couple of turns of the
Yeah,
game.
that's two very good suggestions. So here you can either go like proactive and have like ancestral recall, but I think it's also very viable to be a bit more reactive and have a card like Force of Will, which I actually think was what he found on this one, which makes it so that he gets to have his second turn, and it makes it so that he can. Oh, he even have the mental misstep for the Dark Ritual. So David is right out the gates here. But I think I spotted a Oath of Druids in Justin's hand, and he found a Force of Will, but we'll have to confirm that, of course.
Wow, the Forbidden Orchard. So
Wow, the Forbidden Orchard. So
yeah,
yeah, that card, the
explain.
five color land. Yeah, this will be a huge drawback if it wasn't in the context of Oath of Druids, because you give your opponent a 1/1 token here, and but that's just fine because that enables your Oath of Druids to trigger on the next upkeep. And David is not playing a deck with any creatures in it, so that's what you need in order to trigger your Oath.
Yeah, so the perfect combination of cards. When I was reading up on Vintage and making some of my notes, I thought that, funnily enough, the best use of Mental Misstep is typically to counter your opponent's Ancestral Recall, and the second best
Yeah.
use is to counter their Mental Misstep when they're countering your Ancestral Recall.
That sounds about right. But I think in this day and age, you misstep more or less anything that hits the stack. I would say like 90+% of the time, because in some matchups, it can be a situational card. So even if, let's say, David led on something like Preordain, misstepping that is not like an absurd play to make. But yeah, now we see what I talked about earlier, just Oath of Druids being such an old card, but still having this new powerful printing of Atraxa, just improving the deck so much.
Yeah, I think last time I remember seeing people play Oath of Druids in non-vintage was when Cognivore was a card that they were milling into. Times have changed. Now we get Atraxa. Looks like Justin is gonna get a couple of good cards from the trigger here. I see a Force of
Definitely.
Will, see a Force of Negation, another Oath, Show and Tell. There's a Flusterstorm. There's a Vampiric Tutor.
Yeah.
So vintage is a format where cards are typically not banned. There's a lot of restricted cards, but the cards that are banned are typically not banned because of their power level. They're usually restricted to one, but they're usually banned because of other reasons. There are these
Yeah.
anti cards, and dexterity, something we don't really want to have on the stream. People flipping their Chaos Orb. So a lot of one-offs that you're going to see in these decks.
Definitely.
Meanwhile, Atraxa resolves. Is Justin firmly in the driver's seat here, or is the
You
Doomsday
can say
deck?
that for sure, because Oath happened with no resistance, and he got to refill his hand with even more counters, and he stopped the ritual on turn 1. So chances are David will have a very tough time overcoming this card advantage plus clock.
This Doomsday deck typically wins after right after you cast Doomsday,
Yeah,
like in
I can talk.
Legacy. Like,
I can talk a little bit about that. So Doomsday, you sometimes win on the spot with cards like Street Wraith or Gush, like getting into your top card that you just put there immediately. But sometimes you have to play a Doomsday and pass the turn. So usually cards like Black Lotus and Ancestral Recall will be cast before the lethal Thassa's Oracle in the end.
what's the difference between the Legacy Doomsday deck and the Vintage Doomsday deck?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I would mainly say the restricted cards like Lotus, Gush, Ancestral Recall. Those cards that makes it, let's say, more simple to win with fewer resources post Doomsday. Because in Legacy you have to like cycle Edge of Autumn, have to make like a clever brainstorm, consider to in your library, stuff like that. It's a bit more fair, I would say.
Does the content of the deck change a little bit as well? I was talking with Philip about Doomsday, and he mentioned that in Vintage, sometimes you maybe run more than one Thassa's Oracle. There's a Cavern of Souls that's typically something we see in the Legacy deck, so that you can force it through a Force of Will, for example. Is this also a thing in Vintage, or is the content of the deck a little bit different in
For
that regard?
okay, yeah, for Vintage, you typically, I think, 2 oracles is stock these days, because it's just so nice to have one to pitch for for a Force of Will earlier in the game and not worry about it. Also, post Doomsday, it's great to have 2 Oracles in the deck because something bad could happen to one of them. Let's say a timely Pyroblast or stuff like that. But the Cavern of Souls we don't play in Vintage simply because once you get to that point, thanks to cards like Ancestral Recall, you find the Oracle and you find like backup. And if you get to do all of that stuff, generally the coast is already clear.
All right. In the meantime, Justin casting a Gitaxian Probe, revealing double Doomsday in David's hand. So this game is definitely far from over. But something that I found interesting was that David decided to attack with the 1/1 token, I believe, into the Atroxa. Is this because he doesn't want to get his board, growing with multiple tokens? Like, how does for the people that don't know how Oath of Druids work, can you explain if there is an option? Is there a window where you can activate the Forbidden Orchard before the Oath goes on the stack in the upkeep, or is that an effect that doesn't actually go on the stack if there are not enough creatures?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, it doesn't trigger if there's an equal amount of creatures. So that's why you'll see players like end of turn on a token, and that's the strategy behind Martin's attack here. David Martin's attack here is if the creature in play, but a second Atroxa trigger could be like very important.
Looks like we're running into some technical difficulties, perhaps. We're gonna try to have that fixed in a moment. In the meantime, David is casting a sleight of hand. These vintage decks typically have a lot of card selection, but unlike in Legacy, Brainstorm and Ponder are the restricted cards. You can only play 1 copy of each. Preordain often being one of the most efficient ways to try to dig deeper into your deck. But yeah, this game is definitely far from over. I think Andreas was trying to also explain how Oath of Druid works. It's a thing where if both of you have 1 creature in play or the equal amount of creatures, then it doesn't trigger in the upkeep. It's not a trigger. It's not as if it would go on the stack and you could play a spell in response that would give you multiple creatures. But it looks like Justin is able, in the meantime, to just straight up win game number 1. Goes to 1-0.
Game 1 there.
Looks like Andreas is back. So can you walk us through what happened towards the end of the game?
Yeah, so basically, Justin, with the help of Atraxa, just buried David in like card advantage and just negated his combo and was able to fire off like 3 attack steps and finish it. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the sleight of hand that you saw there, because sleight of hand is an innovation to the deck that I made originally, because the card doesn't say draw a card. It puts one of the top 2 into your hand. So that's a way to bypass stuff like Orcish Bowmasters, Leovold, Narset when you're building a Doomsday pile. So that card is not better than any alternative, except it doesn't say draw a card on it. So it's just small like tweak to have some counterplay when building a Doomsday pile against anti-draw effects.
Okay. Would you say that Orcish Bowmasters is as big of a thing in Vintage as it is in Legacy, or perhaps even a bigger one?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I would say the effect on the format is smaller, but it's heavily played, so you have to think about it in deck building and how you play, etc.
Okay. Could we perhaps have the deck list on the stream? We can start discussing some sideboarding. You, as someone who is very experienced with the Doomsday deck, what are the cards in your sideboard that you were typically looking for to bring for a matchup like this?
Yeah, so looking at David's sideboard, we have cards like Duress that I like a lot against almost any blue deck. The information is huge, and the fact that you get to take out the worst piece of disruption in their hand, that's just like exactly what the doctor ordered in a matchup like this. Then depending on if he sees himself as the aggressor or he wants to guard a little bit against Justin's broken draws, he can consider Mindbreak Trap, but I would expect him to just bring in Duress and take it from there.
Okay, what about the Oath of Druids deck? What are the anti-combo cards in a format like Vintage? Obviously, your deck already features, the cards like Force of Will and Flusterstorm is typically a card that a lot of people play. Unlike Legacy, this is a format where, because of all the fast mana, all the Moxes, Black Lotus, Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, all that kind of stuff, Daze and Spell Pierce, those kinds of cards, they can get kind of awkward pretty quickly. So, what are the other cards that people use in this format to try to stop their opponents from comboing?
Yeah, great point about the soft counters. I definitely agree. Over a longer game, the soft counters can, like Spell Pierce and Days, as you mentioned, they can get super situational. So generally, cards like Force of Negation and Mindbreak Trap, those are very popular sideboard cards against unfair strategies, which Doomsday is. So I see Justin has one Force of Negation, one Mindbreak Trap, but he also has a couple of Thoughtseize, and that card is great for the same reasons that Duress is great out of David's deck. You get the
Mhm.
info and you get to pick apart your opponent's strategy. And also a card like Nullrod, even though Doomsday only plays Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, and Lotus, Nullrod is good against it because it makes the Oracle like post Doomsday kill less compact. So you can't just play Black Lotus, no, sorry, Ancestral Recall into Black Lotus and Oracle. So you need like more lands to operate post Doomsday. So he will bring that in as well for sure.
I have an interesting question that Philip suggested. Uh, how would you describe Vintage to people that might be looking at our stream and thinking, "Hey, this format looks really cool, but it also seems overwhelming, right? There's so many things going on. Maybe I'm afraid that I'm going to be dying on turn one." Maybe I'll leave that question for a little bit later because it looks like the players already started the game with a turn one duress. Just like you mentioned, David's going to be able to take a look at Justin's hand. So what are we working with? I see one of the Moxes looks like Mox Peril. There is Oath of Druids, Atraxa in hand. How big of a deal is that?
It's not the worst thing because these days you can play 4 of your Oath target because it's blue. It's pitchable to the blue forces.
Mm.
So back in the day, it would have been like you would play like 2 creatures, one Acroma and one Spirit of the Night. I remember that creature suite. That's
Yes.
many, many moons ago, but that would be kind of bad to draw one of those. But here it's not a big deal. Also, you play Show and Tell and you play Flash. So it's even like acceptable to good to draw those cards.
Okay, so what would you be looking at discarding with the duress? If is Oath, just taking your opponents, one of their biggest cards, one of the better
Yeah,
picks, or would you take something like Time Walk? Looks like David actually goes for the Thoughtseize to protect his own hand there.
Yeah, I really like this because David is trying to say, "Hey, I'm the boss. I'm in the driver's seat. I'm the unfair deck at the table." So he clears the way for with Duress taking your opponent's disruption, and he doesn't mind the Oath of Druids sticking in play because David doesn't plan on playing any creatures. So without an Orchard, that card doesn't do a whole lot.
All right, fair enough. Looks like Justin does have the option to deploy Oath here available to him. He can also use Time Walk just as a cantrip to draw an extra card, but you're usually looking to use Time Walk in slightly better ways once you have a little bit more mana, once you're doing more things to try to get something extra out of it. It looks like he is playing the Time Walk here anyway, and David is thinking about this.
Yeah, the pause here from David, you in Justin's seat, you can read that as have a daze, but I'm not sure whether to use it or not, or it's just like strategically keeping your opponent on their toes.
If you're Justin here, are you happy to use the Time Walk just as a way to try to get an extra land off of the top of your deck?
Yeah, I am. I'm not going to be greedy and think, oh, I want to trigger my Atraxa like in the future and then time walk and
Mhm.
have it all. I'm not too greedy with that. I want as most option as possible, and every draw matters here because with David taking the Thoughtseize with the duress, if I'm in Justin's shoes, I would expect to die soon. Like so I need every draw step to help me out to not lose the game.
All right, so it looks like we're entering the mid game phase of a legacy game. The turn one forces and Thoughtseizes and Flusterstorms are over now. Both players are playing some fair cards, Sensei's Divining Top and a Preordain to look at some cards all on the top of their deck.
Yeah, so to answer your previous question, like, Vintage has a lot of games where like the first couple of turns, the decisions matter a ton. But you'll also have games where it's like two players sculpting, trying to find their best window to try and win, or try and find their window to not lose, which is what we could have on our hands here.
Do you think it's the hardest format to get into if you're new to Vintage, or is that going to be very similar to something like Modern?
Oof, that's a great question. So I would say Vintage. There are deck choices in Vintage that will lead to more, let's say, proactive and somewhat simple games, like on average. So there's a lot of like entry decks, and then you can learn the format, piloting those by playing against all of the other decks. And yeah, I think it's like with any format, it has a lot of nuance to it.
One thing that I run into in Modern is, as a player, it's a format that can sometimes be a little frustrating in a way that there are 40 different decks that can win a Modern tournament on any given day, right? So trying to do well in that format with only 15 sideboard cards when you have to prepare for so many decks can sometimes lead to weird pairings. Is Vintage similar in that sense?
Yeah, actually, Vintage has most of the time that I've played it been you make your main deck as serviceable as possible against like blue, that's like default, and then you sideboard your way out of playing against the sort of backdeck strategies and workshop strategies. And it's my experience that you have enough sideboard cards to cover, let's say, all decks. I don't think that problem is so huge in Vintage.
All right. In the meantime, looks like Justin did find his Forbidden Orchard, and I think both players are currently fighting over that Oath of Druids. There's a Force of Will on the stack from David, and Oath of Druids hits the bin there. That has to feel pretty good for David, whose hand looked pretty stacked. I think there's another Force. So he's just looking for that Doomsday. He has some card selection pieces.
Yeah, what I can add to that is that both players have somewhat recent information about their opponent's hand. Justin even refreshed that information with Jitaxian Probe a turn ago. So they both have pretty good grasp of what the opponent has to work with. I believe Justin's hand is right now shown Teletraxa, right? I believe David saw those on turn 1 and they didn't leave.
It's funny how Vintage works. There's so many powerful cards, and a lot of the time there is this giant counter war over one of those game-winning cards, something like a Tinker or Oath of Druids in this case, and then eventually there's this random 2/2 in play that just goes the distance over the next 10 turns.
Yeah, that definitely is something that happens, especially with this day and age where so many decks are playing Urza Saga. So sometimes it's just some constructs getting it over the line, backed up by some blue permission, where neither player gets to do their plan A. So most decks have a good plan B, I would say.
All right, Justin with the Sensei's Divining Top. A lot of mana in play. How often does this deck get to just hardcast Atraxa?
Not too often. I would say it involves Black Lotus 95 times out of 100 when you're hardcasting that card, but it definitely can happen. Generally, most of the time you will lose the game in the meantime if you draw that many mana sources in Vintage. So yeah, pretty rare, I would say.
Justin goes for that show and tell. Is that something that can go wrong for him here? Does Doomsday have something that they would be able to put into play where Justin would go, "Oh wow, I didn't see that coming."
So I've had this happen with Demonic Consultation, emptying your deck and then putting in Thassa's Oracle for the surprise kill. Like that's something that can happen, but it doesn't look like that's what we're ending up here.
So that should be a pretty safe play for Justin here, right? Just casting that show and tell with the intention of putting Atraxa in play. Probably thinking, yeah, there's a very, very small chance this backfires.
Yeah, it doesn't backfire, and even he had 2 mana up, so just a single Flusterstorm wasn't going to cut it for David, so he had to use a Daze and a Flusterstorm. So that's a small win in Justin's book, I would say.
We saw Veil of Summer being used by Mark Tobias in his Doomsday deck in Legacy to great effect. Is that something that you typically find in Doomsday main decks in Vintage as well?
Oh, yeah, no, I think the go-to is just letting the mana base be blue-black. the splash can make it a bit awkward to like cast your cantrips, cast your Flusterstorms, have an island for days. Or if you go for Tropical Island, it's awkward to hard cast your Doomsday. So I think for the mana situation, it's better to keep it blue-black in Vintage for the most part. Unless discard spells pick up heavily, then you can consider a card like Veil of Summer.
We actually find that quite interesting. Mark was playing a version with the Fairy Time Reveler and the One Ring, and he was only playing 15 lands, at least 3 of which were island, scrubland, and a tropical island. So he didn't really have that many ways to actually hardcast Doomsday, but obviously there are cards like Dark Ritual in Vintage. You're going to have Moxes, you're going to have the Black Lotus, so it is going to be a little bit easier that way.
Oh, that sounds like a very ambitious mana base.
He did make it all the way to our semifinals. So Doomsday had a pretty good weekend. I think we had 2 or 3 copies in at the top tables. I think the X2 and better players, there were 2 or 3 Doomsday decks in the end. Is it one of the hardest decks to play in the format in Vintage?
Yeah, I would say so, because a lot of the time I call it like lazy piles. They will get there, but there's a lot of stuff to think about these days. You have Bowmasters, you have Ragavan, like teasing the top of your deck. You have anti-draw cards like Leovold, Sheldred, stuff like that. And just sometimes your opponent just has 7 cards in hand and lets the Doomsday resolve. And then all of a sudden the game is about something else. If your opponent fights over the Doomsday, then at least you know that the coast is clear if it works. But if they just say sure with 7 cards in hand, you have a lot of things to think about when constructing a pile.
Yeah, that's a great point. That sounds like Doomsday is probably one of the hardest decks to pick up and play, because it also requires extensive knowledge of the format in general, right?
Yeah, because if you just play like against a Goldfish and you put an Ancestral Recall on top into a Black Lotus Oracle, and that works, that's fine, right? But sometimes you have to think about Narset, you have to think about Mental Misstep, you have to think about Pyroblast. So yeah, a lot of things, bad things can happen.
All right, in the meantime, David, Treasure Cruise, sort of a different Ancestor Recall, but works just as well in this spot, is on the stack, delving 7 cards away. Justin says, no big deal, draw 3 cards. That has to feel pretty good. Was that
great news for David?
Was that a Gemstone Cavern?
I doubt it.
Okay, that looked, yeah. I was gonna say that'd be an interesting card. Okay, there is a Gitaxian Probe from David. We mentioned that before. Vintage does not have a lot of banned cards. Most of the cards are restricted, the most powerful cards, including Brainstorm and Ponder. The cards that are banned are typically banned for other reasons than being too powerful. The anti cards are banned. The dexterity cards like Chaos Orb and Falling Star are also banned. David, content with just passing the turn. There is the single 1/1 attacking. Justin already down to 11. Show and tell number 2. Still have that Atraxa in hand that David knows about from the earlier Gitaxian Probe. So probably doesn't want to let this resolve, does it?
So plays a Flusterstorm here just in pace 2. Not sure if David has a daze on top of it like last time. But yeah, a Resolve Show and Tell is not only a 7/7 lifelinker, it's also like a draw 5 or draw 6 attached to the Atraxa.
Oh wow, so just uses Flusterstorm there as a spell pierce. How much value is in tapping Justin out in that situation, as opposed to keeping that Flusterstorm to potentially help you combo off on your own turn?
So a scenario I can think about is you want to tap your opponent out so that Flusterstorm is not a good hit. And in that scenario, if you're planning to use all your mana on your own turn, so you don't have the Fluster available, it can be smart. Like win the game with your opponent having Flusterstorm in hand, but you spent your mana on the previous turn untapped, and then you have all your mana available. But that's like a very corner case scenario, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose restricting the opponent's access to 1 mana equals a giant Flusterstorm, possibly, right? Does Justin have a land drop available to him, though? I believe he does. So
Yeah, that's actually a good point.
if he's able to take a blue land from this pile and a Flusterstorm, then that would be a very similar situation. I'm seeing a Force of Will. There is an Oko, a Strip Mine. I think one of the Moxes, and I believe it's an Atraxa.
Yeah, I see the same. Mox Jet and Atraxa to go with the cards you named as well.
All right, plays the Strip Mine. So despite despite watching two combo decks, there's actually a lot of gameplay. There's a lot of card selection. There's a lot of counter wars over some cards. The game actually takes quite a while. When I was first getting into Legacy, I was always telling my friends like, "Yeah, I don't want to get into a format where I'm just always going to be dead on turn two." But that's not really the case in Vintage, is it?
No, I wouldn't say so. But you also have to be ready for like sports states you can't recover from early in the game. That's part of the charm, I would say, for enfranchised players. Like you appreciate that stuff happening once in a while. But of course, as competitive players, we like a good old back and forth.
So would you say that the answers in the format are good enough that they're keeping the threats in check?
Yeah, I would say in general, definitely. But then again, most successful vintage decks both have the unfair angle of doing something early out the gates, but also like a lot of defense. So a healthy combination, I would say. Combo control is like the most successful archetype, I would say.
Mm-hmm. All right, David, casting a Demonic Tutor. Justin, with a Force of Will in hand, we know about that. Do you like letting the tutor resolve here, which could potentially let David take something like an Ancestral Recall, perhaps a Doomsday? I guess he is looking for something better, something like a 2/4/1/3/4 and kind of card, maybe a Flusterstorm to help fight back. What do you think David is looking for here?
Yeah, good. You definitely get the idea here. So depending on David's hand, he's looking to either bait out that Force of Will with like a must counter, or he's looking to make sure that his must counter in hand will resolve. But I think mana is going to be the choke point for David this game.
Yeah, Flusterstorm changed the equation so much. I'm typically used to just counter spells being 1/1 in most of the formats like Modern or even Legacy, but Flusterstorm, not a card that's that heavily played in a format like Modern, but here, is it typically a four of in a lot of decks? Is it typically you start with four forces and then you go from there?
Yeah, Force of Will is the big one. You always want that because the format also has a lot of like good creatures. Flusterstorm is yeah, a bit of a double-edged sword because if you play against something like Mishra's Workshop strategies or Mono White Initiative, that card is just a blank. It only pitches to Force of Will.
Mm.
So some decks will have a split of Flusterstorm and Spell Pierce for that reason. But generally, if you plan on initiating counter wars, Flusterstorm is the king.
All right, David with a brainstorm here. I don't think that's going to resolve just like that. We still need to put two cards back on the top of the deck. Okay. There's a Black Lotus. I see a Ponder, Dark Ritual, and a fetch land. There's a Duress and a fetch land. So David, unfortunately for him, missing the Doomsday.
Yeah, I would say David is all dressed up, but nowhere to go here with the mana in the world, but not the game-ending spell that he wants to. Also, a problem if he casts a Doomsday and doesn't win on the same turn, Atraxa will be lethal because David's at 15. Let's say he casts a Doomsday and has to pass, then he's at 7, and then it's over. So he not only has to find a Doomsday, he also has to win on the spot.
Looks like that Black Lotus was kept in hand alongside the Ponder. So Fetchland can shuffle away the top of his deck. He has a Ponder available. How many turns do you think David has in a spot like this? So Atrax attacks once, Doomsday rounds up. So if you're on one life, you still get to Doomsday, right?
If you're at 1 life, you kill yourself with Doomsday.
Oh, you kill
So
yourself. Oh,
David,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So David has the next turn to try and win, and you see he's keeping the Ponder in hand because his plan is to top deck Doomsday and then Ponder into a win. Uh, what we can see here from Justin's POV is that's going to be very hard to execute.
Wow, yeah. Justin ready with a double force of will. That Atraxa, like you mentioned, one hit would be enough. Put David to 1 on 1 life. It is going to be quite hard to try to resolve Doomsday without dying. Do these decks typically have any kind of life gain? Not really, right?
No life gain. If you're at 1, your way to win is Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. But Doomsday is out of the picture at that point. Cool.
Yeah, looks like David spent most of the 2 games just setting up and trying to look for the right pieces. But every time he tried to resolve Doomsday, Justin was ready with a force of will.
Yeah, that's definitely how the matchup goes sometimes. The oath in itself doesn't do anything. So let's say that's a card fewer for Justin to fight with. Let's say David had a great proactive hand, but once you do like turn the corner and untap, it's definitely super hard from there to be the combo player.
Justin using Flash here to put another Atraxa into play. If you're new to Magic, you might be thinking, well, 2 legendary creatures, that doesn't make any sense, right? Can you walk us through that decision?
Yeah, so with an Atraxa already on the battlefield, the next one will make it so that Justin has to decide which one to keep. So these days we get to keep 1 legend in play. So in practice, this flash is just discard this Atraxa and draw a handful of cards.
Right. So Justin essentially using that flash to look at the top 10 cards of his library, pick up something good into his hand, probably looking for another counter to try to get ready for David's turn, because he also realizes that David is going to be playing his last turn, very likely staring down that Atraxa at 8 life. So trying to do whatever he can to find more disruption, hand disruption, card counter magic, whatever he can.
Yeah, definitely. From Justin's POV, this is about setting up as big a pillow fort as possible, and then hope to make it through to his next turn, which will be the end of David. So funny situation here. He's highly. I think the cards on the bottom is what he's considering taking. He has a show and tell down there, and I think he's taking that because it's blue. Because Demonic Tutor is in a vacuum a better card here, but I think he's taking the show and tell because it's blue and his hand has multiple Force of Wills.
If the players just revealed their hands, I think David would realize that playing against double force with his hand is going to be perhaps too much of an uphill battle. But I mean, if that ponder resolves, he can find an ancestral recall. This is vintage. Things can definitely change in a matter of seconds. You can untap with a horrible hand, draw into an ancestral recall, find a time walk, get some more cards, play a treasure cruise. So this game is certainly not over just yet.
Is this another show and tell?
Yeah, I believe Justin's casting another show and tell. Putting a Pulsus Citadel.
Okay, so he was actually interested in casting that show and tell. I thought it was Force of Will fodder.
All right, now we're casting cards off of the top of Justin's library using his life total. So paying 2 life to get that Oath of Druids into play puts him to 16. Polluted Delta, that's going to be his land drop for the turn. Oh, wow, an Ancestral Recall. You love to see it.
Nice peek we got there. So in a situation like this, it's not going to come up in this scenario, but Justin should have checked his top card with Ancestral on the stack. Let's say it's another instant he can play before Ancestral resolves. It's like super minor, and it's only going to come up in like close Bolas' Citadel games where every piece of life will matter. Then let's say he had like a brainstorm or whatever there. He could have fired it off before the Ancestral actually resolved.
All right, Oath of Druid, pass the turn. David reveals his hand, realizes I cannot beat the 2 forces. Concedes. Justin picks up the match 2-0. That moves him to the 3-0 record. So congratulations to Justin. Pretty cool match there. We're gonna take a little bit of a break here. We're gonna be back with round 4 in just a second. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. Give us a little bit of time, roughly 5 minutes, and we'll be back with round 4.